you have to do this with what I call unconditional self-friendship. You have to do it with a compassionate gaze. You can't beat yourself up for, the story. The story is just the story, man. It's only a story. Like, don't critique it. Don't feel ashamed of it. It's just a story.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the new year. Thanks so much for joining me this week for episode 275, the first episode of 2022, where today we're talking about how to rewrite your self-sabotaging story and how to overcome self-defeating behavior using one of my favorite tools, the incredible tool that is the Enneagram. And joining us today is Ian Cron. He's best-selling author of The Road Back to You. He's a speaker and he's an Enneagram expert. And after leaving today's conversation with Ian, I really trust you'll have clear steps to free your mind from the outdated messages you learned years ago that are just sitting and hanging out in your subconscious, which will empower you to take another step further in becoming the person God designed you to be in your true identity from the foundation of the earth. And that is so exciting to me. But hey, quickly, before we head into the conversation with Ian, if you're enjoying the podcast, share it, send a text to a friend, to a family member, to some random person, I don't care, and invite them to listen to Win Today as well. And then here it is, rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially on Spotify. Yes, ratings are now on Spotify, so go hook me up with a 5-star. And of course, Apple Podcasts. Here's why: when you rate, when you review, and when you share Win Today, the listenership here grows and we get to help even more people design their roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. Because you know my greatest passion, guys. It's that transformation beats the heck out of self-help 11 times out of 10. It's as simple as that. So thanks for listening. Thanks for doing just that. Happy New Year. Welcome to what I believe will be an awesome 2022. Let's get after it. Right now, here's my conversation with Ian Morgan Cron. You're listening to Win Today. Ian Cron, what a joy. Welcome back to Win Today. And it's been about a year since we've seen each other, but I'm just so glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you too, man. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ian. Well, here's where I want to start. Each of the 9 Enneagram types inhabits a broken story. How so?
Well, first off, all of us as children have to concoct a story to help us understand what's happening to us, how we're experiencing the world. And without a narrative, we'd be lost, right? We would just be lost. Now, the problem is that when we unconsciously drag those stories along with us into adulthood, they start to work against us. I mean, it's like they saved us as little people, but when you bring them into adulthood and continue to live out of them, they start to wreak havoc, right? Here's how I know each of them is a broken story. And I self-identify as a Christian, but not everybody does. So, use whatever language you want around this as you please. But, ones, which you are a one, right? The improver, the underlying premise of their false story is that they have to perfect themselves, others in the world, in order to win love and a sense of appropriate control, right, in the world. And the question I would have is, if that story helped you as a child, great. But how is it serving you now? You know what I'm saying? Like, how is that story helping you now as an adult, that narrative, right? And here's how I know it's broken also is because it's in direct opposition to the story of grace. You know what I'm saying? Like, in other words, where does it say in any spiritual tradition that you have to be perfect, that you can't make mistakes, that you have to avoid fault and blame at all costs, that you have to be right, that you have a bounden duty to make the world, to conform the world to your way of thinking, right? To your view of it. Again, helped you as a little person, probably won you strokes, probably helped you survive trauma and everything else growing up. But in adulthood, if you continue to live in that story, it's going to be nothing but trouble in your relationships with yourself, with God, with others, right? It's just going to create a mess. And I love the quote of Mo Willems, the author. He says, if you find yourself living in the wrong story, leave.
Yeah. It's so good. Ian, take us back to your story just for a moment as we set this conversation up, because you were asked a pivotal question at age 27, and it was this: do you ever wonder if you're living in the wrong story? What did that mean for you?
Oh, man. Well, at the time, I was in early recovery from a drug and alcohol addiction. And it was my 12-step sponsor, this 70-year-old therapist, Episcopal priest, who one night after I shared my life story in a meeting with 200 people there, said to me in the car, he said, it's crazy the stories we come up to make sense of our lives. He's like, it's crazy. And then he gets out of the car after I drop him off, and he turns around, he comes back to the car, he asked me that question. He said, do you ever wonder if the story you're living is wrong? And I just was thrown back on my heels. And that really launched me in at least in beginning stages of a journey toward rewriting my story. Like, I grew up in a very broken home, right? And in that home, the way I made sense of it was believing as a 4 on the Enneagram that I had this essential piece missing in my makeup, that I had to compensate for it, that I would never belong, I would never fit in. I would always be a troubled guest on this dark earth, as a 4 would say, right? Well, that story did help me make sense of what I was experiencing as a child. Like, this must be the reason why I'm experiencing this stuff. It's because this is my story.
Yeah.
Now I brought that story into adulthood. And how do you think I coped with a story where I had a missing piece, where I was broken? You know what I mean? Like, that story wasn't helping me as an adult. It was driving me under, it was killing me. So I had to rewrite that story and come up with a new one that was life-giving and more in alignment with the story that I believed God wanted me to live.
How did you do that in authenticity? And the broader question I'm asking is because as a self-pres 1, when my path to disintegration is to the shadow side of a 4. So when you were saying those things, I'm like, oh, I totally resonate with that. But like, how did you negotiate this from a place of authenticity? Because I could see myself going at it one of two ways. When I hear the word broken, I'm like, I want to fix it. But if I'm not integrated in pursuing wholeness, what that looks like, Ian, is I have to fix broken because I am maniacal in my aim to perfectionism, versus I'm in process and I have a desire to improve. Those are really different motivations. So I'm just curious from your end, as someone who's dominant in type 4, like, how did you reconcile, oh, this is broken and I need to pursue wholeness? What'd that look like?
Yeah. So one idea that I would share with you, and that is, you're not bad, Chris. You're just broken. And that's a very big idea.
Okay.
You're not bad. You're broken. Like, 1s are very concerned with being good. You really want to be good. And I'm always telling 1s, I'm telling this message to everybody: you're not bad, man. You're broken. It's okay. It's just that you're broken, man. So let's make sure that broken doesn't equate to bad. Let's just get that out of the way, right?
Oh, that's so good, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, it was life-changing for me. I'm glad it resonates with you, right? So for me, and I talk about this in the Story of You, this new book, as I began to parse, what did I do, right? It's like, well, I talk about 4, I use an acronym, SOAR, right? SOAR. And, I don't like acronyms generally because they're kind of reductive, but having been in a 12-step community for a long time where we use a lot of acronyms, I also know they can save your life. They can make stuff simple and kind of save your life. So that I'll just quickly say it, like, SOAR, SOAR means, first, we got to see the story we've been living. And by the way, this is kind of difficult work, man. It's not, disentangling ourselves from a broken story isn't simple, but it's doable. And I've made it as simple as I think we can get it, right? So C is to really, it has to do with exhuming the bones of the past a little bit, right? It has to do with locating the headwaters of the broken story. It's like, what's the false premise that supports and perpetuates this false story that I'm living in right now? Like, what are the taken for granted beliefs and internalized messages I picked up as a little person that continue to govern my life from the shadows, right? And then just beginning to see it. And by the way, seeing it, and this is important for you as a 1, for every type, but particularly for you, for me as a 4 as well, because I think we have the second loudest inner critic. You have to do this with what I call unconditional self-friendship. You have to do it with a compassionate gaze. You can't beat yourself up for, the story. The story is just the story, man. It's only a story. Like, don't critique it. Don't feel ashamed of it. Don't feel whatever. It's just a story, Then the second stage would be to own it. And that, again, has to do with, we have to kind of count the cost of what has the cost been of living this old story, right? Like what does it cost me in my relationship to myself, my relationship to God, to other people, right? So it's really owning the shadow aspects of the story, right? Then the third step is to awaken, which means realizing that the old story has a kind of trance-like quality to it, right? The problem with living in, a narrative is it's always there. It's always been there. You know what I mean? And so you've just been operating in the story like on autopilot, like just living it, right? Without ever interrogating it.
Yeah.
Right? And we have to learn how to interrogate our false story, right? And then awakening to the ways we get triggered and ways when the old story relaunches, because it's always going to be there, right? And then last thing is our rewrite. How do we rename our story? What are the practices we can engage in that will help us to rewrite that story? The story that I think God wants us to live, which is a story of grace. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of joy. And then also, how do we, when the siren call of the old story starts to sing, how do we resist it? Right? Because it's always going to be calling us back.
Yeah.
It's deeply grooved in our, this is just neuroscience. It's deeply grooved.
100%. The neural pathways have been carved. Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this, though. So you had just said, when the siren of the old story calls, what do we do? How do we respond? So I sort of think maybe there are two proverbial guards to the siren called secrecy and shame. So like for you, Ian, I was just curious, in your story, when secrecy and shame kind of poke their heads out and say, don't you dare go there, don't you dare explore, or this is who you always are, and that tape plays, like, what do you do when secrecy and shame says, don't you dare explore, don't you dare institutionalize or install this acronym SOAR in an effort to better yourself? Like, what happens?
It's interesting. As a 4, I'm naturally self-reflective. I don't feel a lot of shame about self-reflection and looking inward. In fact, I would say that in my most unhealthiest years, I spent too much time looking inward. You know what I mean? Like it can become kind of a fixation.
Yeah.
So that's not that's not going to cause me shame. But the underlying false premise of the narrative that I lived in for so long, which is, Ian, there's something fundamentally broken in you. There's something at your core that's missing that everybody else seems to have. And until you find it, you will never belong. That's the story I told myself for decades, right? And that was the story I inhabited. It got to a point in my life where it was like, this story sucks. I'm sorry. Yeah. I can't put it any other way. This story sucks.
Yep.
And I have to rewrite a new story because, yes, it helped me as a little kid to make sense of the world. But in adulthood, it's screwing me over left and right. It's hurting my relationship with my wife, with my children, with other people, on and on and on. I don't want to live in this story anymore. It's so liberating when you discover, guess what? You're the narrator. You get to determine the story in which you live. You're not stuck with it. You can get out of it.
This may seem a little overly simplistic for what you just described, but like, why do we embody the broken stories in the first place? Is it self-protection?
Yeah, it's really, Well, put it this way. Everybody, think about it this way. Like, Chris, don't you sort of view your life as a movie that's unfolding?
Yeah,
right? It's like
100%.
you listen to music, it feels like the soundtrack to your life.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And it's like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, you understand yourself. This is why we say things to each other like turning a new page, or this is a new chapter in my life.
Uh-huh.
Or we meet somebody and maybe we use the old cheesy pickup line of, hey, what's your story? You know what I'm saying? Like, we think of our lives as stories, right? And so we do adopt those as a way to cope and to kind of make sense of the world, right? And we end up telling that story to ourselves and others, right? Then the story becomes our identity. It's who we are. And it's like, nope, no, that's not true, right? So, for me, it makes complete sense from a psychological and neurological perspective that we experience life as a story that's unfolding. The question is it the right story?
Why are these broken stories so very difficult to recognize then? And you may have tipped your hat to this. Is it because we've lived with them for so long? Like, why is it so hard?
Oh, absolutely. It's the old fish trope effect, right? It's always been there. It's pre-memory, right? So it's just been going on and on and on forever. You don't even know there's a possibility of another story. I can remember sitting with a guy, and I asked him to name his story, right? Like, tell me what the name of your story would be if it was a movie or a memoir. And he said, secondhand boy, because he had grown up in a really, in poverty, and it was very, very difficult. And he always had to buy his clothes in consignment shops, and his friends were rich. And, that became his identity, right? Like, that's me, man. I'm, secondhand boy. And I said, well, that helped you make sense of what you were experiencing as a little person. But tell me, how is it serving you now? And he's like, well, it's not. He says, like, it kind of tortures me, and it, it's made me miserable. I go, well, why are you still electing to live in it? And he looked at me as if to say, you mean I don't have to? And I was like, you totally don't have to. Like, that is I think the great lie here, which is we think we inherit a story from our upbringing and our parents and our, whatever. And then we think, well, that's the story. Well, I'm stuck with it. I just got to do the best I can inside of this story. It's like, no, that's not true. You have the freedom to rewrite that story.
We'll get into how we begin to rewrite that, Ian, but that was sort of an aha moment for him. And I know you had an aha moment, and the Enneagram was a tool to catalyze this aha moment for you. Take us back. Like, what happened in that moment where you realized, oh, I can rewrite my story and something can change?
Well, there's been many moments like that. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just like one moment and suddenly I started the journey and I arrived there. It's like, you realize I'm in the wrong story, man. There is something wrong here. And, for many years, I just knew there was something wrong and I couldn't name it. You know what I mean? Like, it was like, I don't know what's wrong. I went to therapy. I went to church. I did all this stuff. It's like, but what's fundamentally wrong here? There's a guy a psychologist at Northwestern. His name is Dan McAdams. And he has this great quote. And it's basically the premise of the whole book, The Story of You. It's this: all transformation is story transformation. So, you can work above the dirt line to try and make your life better, trimming the tree. But really, what's going to change the story is you have to get down into the root system and uproot it. Yes, sir. Right? And you have to face the underlying premise of your story. And that's what the Enneagram does. It reveals to us the underlying premise of the story. It helps us. It shines a light on these stories. And there's just basically 9 stories, an infinite number of expressions or ways they play out. But man, when you can get down and go as a 1, you know what? I don't want to live in the story of my needing to perfect the world, others, and myself anymore. I don't want to live there anymore. And so it's very powerful when you start to it's empowering, right? When you realize I have agency, I have freedom to change the old story and adopt a new one that will be life-giving and aligned with the things I believe to be true about life.
That's really helpful. I'm just curious about this. Rather, I'm going to make a statement first, because a lot of times people say, oh, the Enneagram puts you in a box. And I've heard you say that, no, the Enneagram shows us the box we're in and helps us get out. Yes. And I just think that's helpful to make a note for the listeners here today, because we are all living these stories, right, from our past, and this is an opportunity to have a tool to help us get out. But Ian, I'm curious about this aspect of the broken stories. Where does self-sabotage come into play as a motivation with these broken stories?
Well, I didn't really explore that in the book, although I did explore self-defeating, self-sabotaging behaviors. Why we do it, it could be, multiple.
Yeah.
Right? That said, I think that self-sabotaging behaviors often come about as a result of fear, right? Mm-hmm. Or they come about as a result of feeling unworthy, right? And so, for example, you might experience sudden success, and suddenly you find yourself not working very hard or doing stuff that seems to be, tanking you, or sort of rewinding your success. And you're like, I don't know why I'm doing this. It's like, well, maybe it's because you're afraid of it. Maybe you're afraid of being scrutinized, being too exposed out there in the world. Or maybe you're doing it because you don't think you deserve success, right? And so that takes a little self-reflection. And those are what I call in the book, taken for granted beliefs, right? We just take those beliefs for granted. And instead of saying, no, I can actually question and push back against those beliefs that end up leading to self-sabotaging behaviors.
What supports us in childhood thwarts us in adulthood. Can you go back to that, unpack that? I'm just curious as to why something in our childhood would help us grow, and then the very same thing would distract us and throw us off course later.
Yeah. Well, this is a long-standing idea, right? Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, said something akin to this. He said, what helps you and keeps you alive in the morning of life will undo you and kill you in the afternoon of life. And that's so true. As a therapist, I don't have a practice anymore, but if I did, that's the reason people would come to see me, is for that reason. It's like what helped me as a little person that I just became attached to. We're very loyal to these old stories, that we're loyal to them because we're worried that if we don't have a story to make sense of our life, well, then who would we be? Who would we be without this story?
There it is.
Right? And so what I'm saying is you'd be far happier. You would be, and, I asked a question, actually, I was on John Acuff's show a while back, and John, I said something to John, it landed with him in a way that was more powerful than I anticipated. I said, who would you be and what could you accomplish in life if you weren't the person you think you are? You know what I'm saying? Like, man, how different would your life be? And that's, again, what a lot of what the story of you is trying to tackle. Like, we organize our identities around these stories. Like, this is who I am. This is who I'm always going to be. I'm always going to be this perfectionist. I'm always going to have this inner critic. I'm always going to do these things. Well, you will always be disposed toward doing those things, but they're not determinative. You don't have to. You can begin to rewind that story and occupy a new one, right? So that to me is so exciting and so life-giving. And in my own personal experience, it's been revolutionary.
Can I ask you to teach the question out that you asked John? Because that was gold. And I want to spend a moment on that, because I feel like, a similar question that I ask people, that people have asked me, that you asked me, is what would you do if fear wasn't in place? And I want to stay there for a second and maybe just have you sort of reverse engineer that question so people can hear it and then almost look in the mirror and go, oh, now I can answer it. What's in that?
Sure. So let me ask you a question. If I asked you the question, who do you think you are? Like as a person, who do you think you are? Who are you at your core, at your inmost self, right? Now, don't give me a theological answer. That's all like, I'm a beloved. No. I want to know what you really think.
This is fun because I'm actually unpacking this right now. And I told Kurt Thompson this. He was on the podcast a bit ago, but we just had some catch-up time as friends after. And I'll just tell you straight up, Ian, I had a dream, and folks listening, you heard me share this, but I'm going to just share it with you, Ian. I had this dream. There was this beautiful home, and I pulled up to it, and it was just beautiful. It wasn't huge. It wasn't pretentious, but it was a neatly manicured lawn. It was a nice little brick ranch. I thought, this just feels like home. And so as I walked into the house, I was like, wow, this really feels like me. But I couldn't identify it yet. Well, as I got into the interior, there was this room, an unfinished room with just scaffolding, and it was framed in with electrical wires and OSB on the floor. And as I looked in, there was a little boy version of me on the floor, and he was crying with his head between his legs. And he looked up and saw me, and he said, "You abandoned me." The journey I've been working toward in wholeness since you and I even last talked is that, Ian, at my core, I'm deeply curious, I'm deeply sensitive, and I'm deeply gentle. And I have taken the majority of the last 2.5 months reconciling that. So when you ask me the question, who are you at your core? That. And I'm coming to terms with that because the shadow side and the overextended side of my desire to improve is perfectionism, which is why I think I saw in that dream a perfectly manicured lawn. A lot of my self-worth in the past has been determined by my performance, my good doing, my well-doing. And I'm just come to terms with in my own life, Ian, that my masculinity isn't diminished by me being very curious or very sensitive or very gentle. And that's been a hard, tear-filled journey. So I know that was a very long answer, but I wanted to give you sort of a picture behind the answer to that question.
So what you just described, first of all, thank you for sharing it and for your vulnerability. And also, it's an amazing dream. And I hope you have journaled it to its finest detail.
I did.
And what you've described is this self-discovery that I'm gentle, that I'm tender, that I'm sensitive, right? That is the grist for a new story. You know what I'm saying? Like that is the beginning part of understanding of a new underlying premise for the story. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to perfect the world and others in order to be loved and to be of value, to be good. It's just not true. Where does it say that in our sacred texts? In fact, it says just precisely the opposite. That story is in direct opposition to the story that God would have us live, right? And so you're beginning this journey of rewriting a story. What the story of you does is give people who perhaps aren't that far along or have done some work a framework to really move forward in the journey of rewriting the new story to replace the old one that had just become too painful to stay in any longer.
Ian, I love this conversation because what I noticed, to your point, as an example, is that what I was doing in a disintegrated fashion is I was building out this scaffolding of ego projection, egocentricity, which not self-centeredness, but just scaffolding that was self-protection. And it had a name, and its name was perfectionism. And now, Ian, I am so coming to terms with, and this is why I was telling you before we hit record, this book has been a gift and just an answer to prayer for me in many ways, because now I can sit on my couch and be folding laundry and go, I wonder what that would be like. Curiosity, gentleness, tenderness, sensitivity, and now I can actually be true to the fact that God has wired me as a strategist, as an improver, and it doesn't have to go into, if I don't do this and if this fails, I suck as a person. So I just wanted to give that perhaps as just a case study to what you just said, because it's a brilliant turn of events in my own life.
Yeah. Well, I think, the story of you would support, illuminate, and even widen your understanding of the journey that you're on. We teach in the Enneagram that every type has a passion and a virtue. The passion is this emotional we also call it a deadly sin, but it's this powerful emotional motivation that colors our interior world and drives the continually dysfunctional patterns of personality that we find ourselves living in, right? So for you as a 1, it's anger. Usually it's resentment towards yourself and others.
Yes.
For your particularly toward others, because they're not as concerned as you are with improving the world and themselves. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
Right. And then anger at yourself that you just aren't good enough. You just can't meet your own high internal standards. Now, the journey of transformation for you is to move toward the virtue, not the deadly sin, but now the virtue of serenity, right?
Yes.
And so serenity is not just this sort of flaccid peace. What I mean by that is it's this okayness with the fact that the world is broken. It's just okayness, right? And that there isn't enough time in the world, time, energy, resources, or everything else for you to fix everything and everybody. And that it's, and so serenity is okay with, I made a mistake. I did this wrong. It's not I am something wrong. It's just I did something wrong.
Man, that's
or I
good.
didn't do it correctly. That's the new story, is embodying that virtue of serenity. Like, it's okay. I'm not bad. I'm just broken like everybody else. There's nothing. See, it's interesting, isn't it? That so many people grow up in faith traditions where they were told they were bad rather than told they were just broken. There's such a difference, bro.
It's so true. I'm studying kintsugi right now, actually. So the fact that we keep saying broken is beautiful to me because, goodness gracious, I'm so embarrassed. I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Fujimura.
Fujimura?
That's exactly right.
I have to tell you something. Mako is one of my best friends. And
you got to be kidding me.
I've known Mako for 25 years. And I have a kintsugi bowl in my living room that Mako gave me that's about 200 years old. And for those people who are listening, I'm sure you've probably told this before, but the word kintsugi just means golden joinery. And what it is, when a person would, in China or Japan, Korea, would drop a valued tea bowl, and they carry a lot of historical power in those cultures, right? They're valued, they're passed down generation to generation. They would bring it to a master craftsman who would glue them back together using a lacquer made from a tree sap, right? And then dust it with powdered gold, so that when you put it back together, this is the genius of it. The piece that's now been repaired is more beautiful than it was prior to its breaking.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this is, by the way, in my mind, that is the gospel. I mean, I actually just did a talk on this 10 days ago in Florida. I actually held up that bowl and I said, listen to me, this is the gospel, right? The bowl is not bad, it's broken. And God's job is to repair it. I mean, the great author Eugene O'Neill once said, he said, man is born broken. He needs mending. God is the grace. Or no, God is the glue. And that's what kintsugi is.
It's so beautiful, Ian. In fact, I'd love to just talk about this for a moment, because one of the things I think I've discovered in my own journey, and then reading this book and talking with you a few times, is this. There is, in the process of writing a new story, there is struggle in that. There's a birthing process for sure. But I've noticed this in my own life, that the pathway to peace and identity in life is not the absence of trouble. It's found through pain, not around it. You want to talk about the struggle that is so necessary in this process of formation. And this is what I love and appreciate about you with your spiritual formation and spiritual direction background, because this process of formation is ongoing, and formation requires struggle. Let's talk about the requirement of struggle in the process of formation and becoming.
Well, you're absolutely right. And this is everybody's looking for a hack, man. You know what I mean?
It's so true.
Everybody wants to give me a hack to get to, my happy place, my, whatever. And I'm like, there isn't one. There just isn't one. Like, all growth involves suffering, pain, work, effort, sweat, right? And, sadly, most people won't do the work until they hit a wall and they have no other choice. They just sort of stay stuck in an old story. It's like, you don't have to, man. Like, just do the work. Like, do your work and, see the story, own what the story has cost you and others, awaken to the how the story works and how it gets triggered, how it launches, and then go into the process of rewriting it. And you'll probably do this multiple times. You have to practice it multiple times. It's not like you're going to get through SOAR and then suddenly go, I'm done. It's like, no, now you have a framework for continued work throughout your life, because that old story is sticky, man.
Yes.
It is sticky.
Yes.
And, it's kind of like, well, it's the devil I know, right? And so we just go back there, and it's like, no. And the more you do it, the more malleable, like all that you were talking about, how that gets carved into our neural pathways.
Yes, sir.
It's like just the softer it gets, the less influential, the volume on it goes down.
Okay, so I'm curious about that, because you just said that, there are some of us who will run hard, for lack of a better word. It's sort of stubbornness, right? Till we hit that wall and say, oh, okay, I've got to make a change. I'm just curious, Ian, does that behavior show up differently in the triads? I resonate with that as a 1, because I'm like, nope, I'm driven. I'm going to pound this thing down till it moves, right? I could see maybe an 8 doing that as well. So I think about 8s, 9s, and 1s like me. Do triads behave differently in that mode of operation, if you will?
I don't think so. I think
Just
it's
curious.
a human condition thing. We, and a lot of it is how we approach things has to do with, how great is the motivation? How much pain is there? You know what I mean? Like, the more the pain, the more you're motivated to, do your work. Right. And so, I think it's just is sort of situationally dependent, for each type. Now, I do think certain types have to burn more calories to do the work, but that doesn't mean that they can't be very, very successful in accomplishing or achieving.
Play that out. I'm just curious. I think about some of my dearest friends are very, very dominant 7s. And I think about, and I'm not trying to demonize any 7s that are listening, but 7s desire to avoid pain. And then I think about my tendency to go toward perfectionism, or a 6 that'd be like, fear is my kryptonite. Like, play that out. How would that manifest in the struggle?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a 1, one of the things that you have to struggle with is, as I rewrite my story, as I do my work, I have to do it perfectly. You know what I'm saying? In other words, which is the most self-defeating thing in the world. You're using the old, the bad premise of your old story to try and create a new one, and a better one. Doesn't work, man. Right?
Yep.
Twos may find themselves, they're so out of touch when they're unhealthy with their own needs and their own feelings. That's what's going to be hard for them, right? Getting back in touch with those. A 3 might approach this as a to-do or a goal. You know what I'm saying? In a way that isn't going to be very, very, very helpful. They also may say, there's no measure of success here, so it's like, why bother, right? I could go through all the numbers. I don't want to take too much time to do it.
You're fine.
The point is that every type is going to have its own struggles with, doing the work, right? 4s can get stuck in their feelings. 5s can intellectualize the work, right? 6s may rely too much on others as they do the work out of, because they don't trust their own interior world. 7s just may want to avoid the pain of it all, right? Now, I think when the healthier we get, the more great resources we have to do the work, right? But of course, if any of those types really hits the wall, really hits it, then the motivation to start looking at the story of their life and rewriting it, right, is, the motivation is greater. Now, I just want to make one thing clear. this is joyful work too. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want this to come off as being just like, man, this sounds like a real bummer. The answer to that is no. Do you know how exciting it is?
Right.
You do, right? You're discovering I'm gentle, I'm tender. This story, this is
Ian,
part of my, this is part of the new story. I don't have to live in the old story anymore. It's like, man, there are moments that'll bring you to tears of joy on the journey, right? It's like, I don't want this story anymore, and I don't have to live in it, And I've had many experiences, in recent years where I find myself back in the old story with the same patterns of feeling and thinking and behaving the way that I see the world, right? And then I just kind of go, in the moment, I've caught myself so many times, I go, do you really want to live in this story anymore? No, not really. It's like, okay, well, why don't we just get out of it right now and move on into the story that we're called to live and embody that.
Stay there for a minute, Ian. Let's zoom out because I'm really curious to what you said when you're in that moment yourself. So if people are listening right now and saying, okay, are there everyday life clues or situations in my life that we could use to determine if we're still living a broken story? Like, what might those situations be, or seasons in life that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times our feelings will tell us, right?
Okay.
As a 2, let's say on the Enneagram, and you start to feel that tug to start meeting the needs of others and disavowing your own in the hope that someone else is going to meet your needs without your having to come out and ask for it directly, right? It's like when you start to feel that tug to say yes to everybody, to you know what I mean? And like to get burned out helping people and like all that stuff, you can catch yourself earlier and earlier in that scenario and put the brakes on, right? Say, this is not the story I want to live anymore. Nowhere does it say in my sacred text that in order to be loved, I need to meet the needs of other people. That is in opposition to the story of grace.
It's so true.
Right? So, and then making a conscious, free decision that I'm not living this story anymore. That story helped me grow up, but it doesn't help me now. In fact, I want love, and my behavior at this very moment is probably going to prevent me from getting the love I want.
Yeah, Ian, I want to stay here a little bit further for the listeners, because in your book, you wrote that the stories that once served us right now, we're now serving them.
Yeah.
So unpack this a little bit more. How does this play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, right? The stories we use to in service to getting our needs met, to feel safe in the world, to protect ourselves, to make sense of things as little people, right? Well, eventually they don't work anymore. We start serving them. Now we're at their mercy. And I will say this, until we surface them and we begin to look at them with clear eyes and say, oh my gosh, that's been the underlying premise of my life story. No, that's got to go. You know what I mean? Like, that's got to go. And you have to undertake that journey with a great deal of compassion and love. It's just so important that we do it with compassion and love. Just to remember that old story, it was well intentioned. You know what I mean?
I do.
It really wanted to help you, and to be able to kiss it goodbye and say thank you is really important before you enter into the new story.
Stay on shame for a moment, Ian, because I tend to think in life that shame manifests in either self-protection or self-promotion. So when we look at the 9 types, do any of the types lean more heavily toward one of those than the other? So for me, self-pres Enneagram 1, I lean far heavier into self-protection than I do self-promotion, but I would love to know your thoughts.
I think 2s, 3s, and 4s, sometimes that heart triad is called the shame triad.
Really?
And yeah. And so I think 2s, 3s, and 4s, and 4s probably more than any other type on the Enneagram wrestle with shame. And, as I've said many times, shame is like the most toxic force in the universe.
Yeah.
It is just soul killing stuff. And we often, weaponize it and shoot it at ourselves, thinking it's going to make us better, right? It's going to help us get our act. And it just actually, what happens is you will begin to, when the shame starts going, you start defending yourself against it, and it's bigger than you.
There it is.
It's bigger than you. So really, part of dissolving the trance of shame is being able to look at it with compassion, not fight it, man. Don't fight it. This requires judo. You got to use its energy, right, to defeat it. So it's almost like just to look at it with love and with compassion and go, oh, it's okay. It's all right.
I love that you just said that. You know who Adam Grant is?
I know his name, but I don't.
No worries. Yeah. Well, he wrote a book called Think Again. Anyway, he was saying today on Instagram, sympathy and empathy have their role, but really what's needed is compassion in our journey to wholeness. So for you to say that, I think really galvanizes the point today for us to say, what does it look like to embody compassion in my journey to wholeness? So fascinated by that. Ian, I'd love to swing into talking about relationships, because a lot of the content we talk about here on the podcast is around health and wholeness in relationships. How do broken stories in each type catalyze attraction to other broken stories? Any thoughts on that?
I've never thought about it, but it's a great question. It's interesting, isn't it? Just even in psychology, we know this is true, but we end up marrying people many times for reasons we don't know we're marrying them. Right. That's why we always say, oh, I married my mother. Well, maybe you did, because you're trying to resolve some unfinished drama with mom through your wife or your husband. You know what I'm saying? It's like, and usually around the age of, I don't know, unless maybe some crisis can precipitate it earlier, but let's say 35 or 40, and you realize, geez, I've spent the last, 15 years trying to change this man or woman into the person I want them to be because it would make my life easier. It's like you get to this point, it's like, I got to make a decision here in this relationship. Do I accept them for the person they are or not? Even, do I accept them as the person they are? And even though they're not going to become the person I would like them to be, can I celebrate the person they are? And that when that happens, if you can make that shift successfully, it's fantastic, right? It really shows up in a relationship. I don't know if a person in one kind of broken story doesn't work with another one. I'd have to think more about it.
Ian, I know this phrase has become sort of cliche, but I'd love to know, in this context of healing broken stories, what does it mean to do the work?
I define it in the book as the work is all the energy and practices that are required in order to move from the passion of your type to the virtue of your type. So for you to move from resentment and anger towards yourself and others in the world for not, living up to your high internal standards, moving into serenity. 2's moving from pride to humility. 3's from the deadly sin of deceit to authenticity. So this is just one framework, but I think it's a very helpful one. And the work might be self-reflection. It's therapy. It's spiritual direction. It's showing up. It's getting honest. It's coming out of the shadows of secrecy and shame and being able to share the journey with other people, and so that you can realize, guess what? You're just another bozo on the bus, pal. Everybody's in the same, everyone's in the same boat, So these are just a few things that we have to do to begin the work. And again, man, people sometimes will, particularly in faith-based communities, they make the work hard. They make the work harder, I should say, because it's all like, well, let's just focus on God. If you spend too much time thinking about yourself, it's going to become self-absorption and egotistical. It's like, man, nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. People who lack self-knowledge are a danger to themselves and the community around them, So,
100%.
I think it can lapse into that if you're not careful, but if you do it well, it doesn't have to go there.
I've never asked you this question, but I've wanted to. Why are you so devoted to this specific work of the Enneagram? Like, with the Enneagram, what's the passion point? You're a master teacher, but I've always just wanted to ask you, like, why the passion for this?
Well, before I knew the Enneagram, I was an Episcopal priest. I was a psychotherapist, songwriter. I was a speaker. I was an author of 2 other books unrelated to the Enneagram. Chris, for me, my whole life has been dedicated to helping myself and others enter into deeper conversation with the mystery of God and with their own lives, right? That's just sort of been what I've done since I was a little person. And for me, the Enneagram is a great conversation starter. It's not the only tool.
Right.
It's not like, this is the magic bullet, to solve all problems, It's like, no, this is just one great tool that I have found terrifically helpful. And I just love inviting people to accompany me on that journey, and to give me the honor of accompanying them on theirs.
I love that.
And so, will I be doing the Enneagram in 10 years from now? I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
But for this moment in my life, for the last, 8 years or whatever it's been, this has been the most helpful tool I know to accomplish what I feel my vocation is.
It's so good. It's so helpful. Ian, this is a little bit of an obscure question, but you tipped your hat to it when we were talking about faith communities and such, because the question I get from listeners once in a while is, listen, should Christians use the Enneagram? I want to poke that box with you because I want to debunk some of the ungrounded dialogue around this question, because yes, syncretism is real, but for me, Ian, this has been such a powerful tool, and it's a tool. Like the power of God, the gospel transforms my life, of course. What's your wisdom on this? Because I want to put this thing to rest, at least here on Win Today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Enneagram has Christian roots, so I'm not sure what, I don't see anything in the Enneagram that is discontinuous with the gospel. If it was, I wouldn't have been sniffing around, with it. I would say that, in my experience, what the Enneagram does is it helps illuminate those parts of who we are that are broken and those parts of us that are beautiful. For me, it illuminates the broken stories that people live in and provides a roadmap for us to enter into the true life-giving story that I believe God wants us to live. And that, of course, is what the story of you is all about. I cannot see in any way, shape, or form how that is inconsistent with what Jesus taught, or, you know what I mean? It's I don't know. Now, listen, there are people in the world who are just fundamentally anxious people.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And they tend to be people who question anything that is new or feels like, okay, and they just get anxious. And sometimes that anxiety comes out as anger too. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit like I go, look, well, first of all, if it's not for you, it's not for you. That's okay.
Right.
Now, I'm not offended.
Yeah.
Go find another tool. There's others that are equally as effective. I'm not saying that the Enneagram is the be all to end all of everything, And when I meet people who do, I just roll my eyes and move on to somebody else in conversation. It's like I don't really want to get in here, but what I say to people is Christian roots, and it has the fruit of it in people's lives spiritually. I've not met anyone who said this made me a less of a Christian. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
or
Ian.
I just have never met anyone who ever said that to me. So
I get it. Now, Ian, thanks for going there. It is a question I receive from time to time, as I mentioned, and I thought, well, you're coming back on the podcast, and so I want to ask you, and to the best of my ability, just put this issue to bed as far as Win Today goes. So thanks for going there with me.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
Ian, anything else we haven't covered today that you'd like to share? Your brand new book is out. I'd love for people to stay connected to you.
Folks can go to my website, ianmorgancron.com, ianmorgancron.com. They can learn about all the different things we do. We have multiple courses available on the Enneagram. We just launched one this morning it's called Discovering You, which is an introduction to the Enneagram. We have another course that's a little bit more advanced called True You. We have this, of course, the new book, The Story of You. Mm-hmm. I am so excited about the possibilities and the ways that this story this book may be life-giving to people. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, that's my vocation. So I hope it achieves what I'm praying it will.
That's so good. Hey, Ian real fast, tell people about the Typology Institute. it's really cool, and I'd love for people to know a little bit about that too, if you would.
So the Typology Institute is essentially the overarching structure, or place where people do learn about courses, and where we are putting out content to help people on their journey, their spiritual and emotional and psychological journey. It is a place of just growing resources for people to move toward wholeness, which, as you know, by the way,
yes, sir, derives
from the word integritas, which means integrity. And so helping people move toward integration and integrity as human beings.
You asked me a question when I was on your podcast earlier in 2021, and you were like, Chris, what does it really mean to live an integrated life? And I love that you just took us there as we land this plane, Ian, because no one domain of our life can function independent of the other two. And this is the opportunity for us to reconcile the story of who we are, just to run full circle with this and really become the version that we were created and designed to be. And that's exciting to me. So Ian, thank you for being here today. I love our conversations and just have a lot of honor for you. So thank you.
Thank you, brother. You too.
wintoday.tv/episode 275. That's wintoday.tv/episode 275. Go there right now. Within the show notes is a link to purchase a copy of Ian's brand new book. Additionally, I've embedded the YouTube video from the episode of his podcast, the Typology Podcast, in which I was the guest. That was really fun. So if you want to watch that, you can check it out there. Again, wintoday.tv/episode 275. And listen, next week, I'm joined by Dr. Dan Allender. We're talking all about how to redeem heartache. So if you've walked through crisis, loss, disappointment, or perhaps you're in the grief process and wondering how you're going to move through, this is the conversation for you. Here's a preview.
We've got, in one sense, a prolonged deepening of our own trauma. We've been traumatized, but now we re-traumatize ourselves. In one sense, as crazy as this is, as a means of getting back into Eden, we re-traumatize ourselves with a hyper-focused, critical spirit, in part to restore. How could we restore by blaming ourselves? Well, if I'm at fault, then it can be resolved. If you are the actual perpetrator and I'm a victim, then there's not much I can do. And so we would rather have power through our contempt than actually to have grief and feel even more fragile.
Next week, Dr. Dan Allender is here. We're talking all about how to redeem heartache. Don't miss it. Thanks again for joining the conversation this week right here on Win Today. I believe people just like you should be able to live successful, meaningful lives, and that's why I want to invite you to join the inner circle of readers on my email list who get weekly, well-researched self-improvement tips. So right now, go to wintoday.tv to sign up. It's absolutely free. And lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on the Apple Podcasts app. So right now, will you write a short, honest review? Doing so helps expand the listenership of Win Today, and that would mean a ton to me. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.